When American cinema was getting standardized industrially, the category named genre it appeared. Genre was needed to standardize both the production and the reception of certain films. So one can say that almost the majority of the films fell either in any known categories during the advent of sound cinema. The genre helps to standardize the product because through a genre, either it can be a gangster or a western or a musical, it starts communicating the content of the film, the style of the film, and what to expect from the film and what not to, right from the days of its publicity, even before that. So the studios, they will start specializing about certain genres. So therefore, when a studio is producing a film, it will have a definite set of writers, definite set of directors even, and mainly a definite set of stars. So Humphrey Bogart is someone whom you don't expect in a western, or John Wayne would be a star you don't expect in a musical. And this standardization helps in the level of iconography, in the level of designing the posters, in the level of acting style. So Fred Astaire would act in a different style, and Bogart and Wayne would act in a different style altogether, specific to the genre. And it also has a deep impact on the narratives. So different genres will have different narratives, different trajectories of narrative, and different satisfactions which come from viewing the narratives. So one can say that genres, they create a possibility of satisfaction with variations. Therefore, it's a kind of sequence of familiarity and surprise. A surprise would come from a deviation from a genre, and then the familiarity will yield to a kind of known predicament of the narrative, so on and so forth. So one can use the example of Western as an exemplary genre, and can tell about its course throughout the history to show how different phases of Western, how it actually creates impact on the narratives, how the narratives also change. Mainly Westerns, they talk about tell stories about the expansion of the American civilization towards the western side of the continent, after the eastern side is saturated and thoroughly urbanized and saturated, how the entire civilization slowly moved towards the west, towards the Pacific, and in the process replaced another extant civilization, that is the Red Indians. This westward journey, the stories of the westward journey, myths it kind of created, the fables, the folklores it kind of created, they become the staple diet of the Western stories. In that sense, the Western, it had a root in popular pulp literature. That is the way the Easterners, that is the people in New York and other places in the urban centers, the way they imagined the West to be. And therefore, one often says that it has less to talk about the authentic West and more about a kind of imagined West. Why did Westerns become a kind of successful genre, at least from the 1930s till 1960s or something like that? Western as a genre also died out. It had its demise. So why did Western actually become successful? One definite reason was this shift of the filmmaking centers from the eastern part, that is from New York and other places, towards West. That is when Hollywood was established. When Hollywood was established in the western part of the country where the sunlight was rather even throughout the day, and the raw material was the resources, labor, and other land price that becomes very important, was rather cheap. And when this entire establishment shifted to the West, the local resources that the local folks fables and the people who often would populate the scenes as extras and others, and the local atmosphere, the stories were there in the air. It created a ready resource of narratives which can be shot in landscapes which was also nearby. The landscapes in the vicinity of Hollywood, they then started playing a definitive role in this kind of genre, in westerns. The role of the landscape in westerns is a bit different from the role of the cityscapes supposedly in noir, or in a different film movement like that of neorealism. While in neorealism, the ground in which the figures they are moving, the grounds will act as the site of historical social reality. In case of the Western, it would be an empty landscape on which history, the imaginary history, would be played out. So in a genre, the narratives are standardized, the bodies are standardized, the stars are standardized, the iconography is standardized, the costumes are standardized, even the setting is standardized. If you think of the setting, so supposedly you go to watch a film noir, you can definitely expect that it will be in an urban setting. And therefore, similarly, in a Western, it will definitely be a non-urban setting. The setting would often be of a landscape and of makeshift towns. The towns are also very standardized towns, so you almost know the geography of or the topography of a Western town. If you watch 10 to 15 Westerns, you know that there is a saloon. A saloon is a place where the economic transactions take place and where the important narrative and social interactions take place. And there might be a church, there might be a school, there might be a stable, so on and so forth. Andre Maza, in his essay, has said that that the Western, they gather a universal appeal, though being a resultant of a very specific national culture. They gathered an universal appeal because this is the last example of myth making. So Westerns, they are actually creating a myth where every element, they have a definite role to play. So you have a definite masculine role of the hero, a definite role of a woman to play. The horses, they have a kind of meaning. They gather a kind of meaning. The landscape gather a meaning. And even something as innocuous as a rail line, they gather a kind of epic meaning. And because of this story of a nascent modern civilization, so the civilization is not something, not medieval. It's modern, but still the civilization is nascent, and therefore there is certainly in 19th century there is a situation where we find a context where we can create the stories of the making of a civilization. But the people who are actually in a Western story, the people who are populating this empty barren lands, they are mainly immigrants. They are immigrants from Europe and other places, or they are immigrants from the eastern part of United States of America. And therefore, they come with a kind of definite values. Therefore, in Westerns, we often find these historical conflicts between supposedly the white settlers and the red Indians, or the white settlers who have settled, who are farmers, with white truant kind of villains who are lawless bandits. Or often there will be situation of a modernization of the society through the rail lines, through the establishment of the rail lines, and and the conflict between older settlers who are more agricultural. So this kind of conflicts, this kind of dynamics would often create the story. And all stories therefore becomes a kind of miniature playing out of the history. A miniature playing out of the history which will start from a status quo, go into a kind of status quo disturbed, and the restoration of the status quo again. And therefore in stories after stories, as they were standardized with the advent of sound, and the narrative, the duration of the feature film getting standardized, we will slowly see that in westerns a kind of value of violence comes in. Now this is an interesting point, because the films which we have lost during the silent era, the western stories would tell stories of fighting, horseback riding, and the trains and the bandits and so on and so forth, creating a spectacle of action, movement, etc. With the advent of sound, the western actually for a transitional period of time transformed into musicals. So you had the singing cowboy. But as it happens in a genre, certain stories survived and certain stories had their demise. So the singing cowboy gradually disappeared, and with the standardization of the western during the sound era, we find stories where violence plays a significant role. And this violence has a certain economy. So almost all westerns would start with a kind of laying out of the ground for a certain kind of social dynamics, a certain kind of conflict between the good and the evil, and the entire narrative with climax towards a shootout, either a battle between the Indians and the white might be, or a shootout between the good man and the evil man. And in this way, with the shootout, with the violence, a kind of status quo is again restored in the town or through the narrative. And often in the westerns, we find that the western starts with arrival and ends with the departure of the hero. Like for example in Shane. So in westerns, the narratives always plays out a kind of situation of choice, where one can be something or one can be someone else. Like for example, in a film like John Ford's My Darling Clementine, we see Henry Fonda playing Wattier arriving in the town of Tombstone, and he has the option either to settle down or to go away. He restores law and order in this town and he goes away. So westerns always keeps the possibilities open. On hindsight, if one feels that why did the western appeal so much, starting from the 30s till 50s and 60s, I think that the western appeals because it plays out these historical choices in front of the spectator, who then kind of has the pleasure of performing the choices in history. And therefore, slowly, when these choices became less appealing to the spectator, this entire narrative died out. The course of the genre also has certain impact on the trajectory of narratives. So in westerns, for at least 3 to 4 decades till the 50s, we have a standard myth making process going on. And at the end of the 50s, mainly with John Ford's The Searchers, we find that this classicized format of the genre would start being questioned by certain leading auteurs, where the standard norms of the genre would be questioned. So therefore, at the end of the narrative, when the shootout or the violence is happening, instead of a restoration of order, often in films like The Searchers we find an opening up of a newer conflict or a newer disturbance. This has a peculiar structure in a different genre altogether, which is also a subgenre of Western, but it has its interesting history. By the end of the 60s in Italy, certain Italian directors with Italian cast and crews, with exceptions of certain leading characters who are actually Americans. They created a definite genre which is called the spaghetti western. Now the name spaghetti western is a kind of derogatory name. The spaghetti westerns were those westerns which are not produced in Hollywood but in another country altogether. Now these directors, they were acting like cinephiles, and they were acting like cinephiles who were in love with older Hollywood films as such. But they themselves, they were Italian directors. And here we find a very peculiar situation. These directors, who often were leftists or communists, like in the case of Sergio Corbucci, they were critical of America as a state, America as a political entity, but they were in love with older Hollywood films. This conflict, they had a very fruitful resultant in the spaghetti westerns. So in spaghetti westerns, we see that those climactic shootouts, they become a regular event throughout the course of the narrative. As a resultant, the epic value of the violence was slowly lost, and they created a rather brutal, inhuman world in the westerns, which was not found in the classical genre. So while in the classical genre, there were always the establishment of a certain kind of national identity, one can say, a national American identity, what it is to be a good American hero, a good American man, a good American woman, so on and so forth, and what a good American town would be like. Then, in the hand of the cinephiles, with this recurrent shootouts going on and on and on, they created a rather brutal, violent, heartless world, a world of avarice and greed, which ironically became more true to the authentic Western stories.